We're on that if somebody from Mecca who wasn't a Muslim says Assalamu alaikum, you're supposed to nevertheless respond. So this shows you that Assalamu alaikum is universal, because the people in Mecca who weren't Muslims were saying it too. And some of the Muslims were kind of now wondering, well, should we respond? The Quran says yes. So let me hear it louder. Thank you. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks so much for the kind invitation. I know of UMAA's work and I admire the organization. It's great of you all to give your time to it this weekend. I have a charge here to talk a little bit about, as an academic, obviously as somebody from outside the community, but to talk a little bit about what I see as the situation of the community and its challenges, especially here in an American context. So next slide, please. Well, there's one before. Yes. So one of the things that I always tell my audiences to remember is that the United States is a society of immigrants. Everybody, including the Native Americans, has come here from someplace else. Natives came a long time ago. But nevertheless, we're all immigrants in this part of the world. And there is a trope in American society as a result of being an immigrant society that the people who've been here, a year or two, start looking down their noses at the ones who just got off the boat. There's a configuration of people as immigrants and as Native Americans or as genuine Americans or as longtime Americans or something. And one of the things that can happen many times is that historical injustices are done this way. So there's a group of people known as Californios. Most of you have seen Zorro, right? Zorro is about a hero who is a Californio. And the Californios were the old Hidalgo, the aristocrats of the Spanish Empire who were in California in the early modern period. And then when the Americans took California and incorporated it into the United States, the California stayed, and they were landlords, and they were very substantial people. Over time, the white people who came in from Kansas and so forth started looking upon the Californios as Mexicans, as recent immigrants. And there's nothing that will make a Californio more angry than to be confused with a recent immigrant from Mexico. And from the point of view of the Californios, they've been here all along. It's the people from Kansas who are the immigrants. So the same thing is true with regard to the Muslim Americans, is that they're often now configured in public discourse in the United States as an immigrant community. And of course, this is not untrue. But what's not recognized is that the history of Islam in North America is very old, and certainly much older than most of the people who are talking about it. But it's hidden. It's something that we historians can't get out very easily. But the fact that we can't get it at it very easily doesn't mean it's not true. So for instance, they started bringing African slaves here in the 1600s. Well, about 10% of them were Muslim. They were being brought from Mali, Senegal, and Nigeria, and so forth. So if you think about all the labor that Africans did in the New World, the raising of rice and other crops in North Carolina is basically their techniques. They brought them here and the white people adopted them. Or the labor they put in buildings. The Africans built the White House, African slaves. So 10% of all of that labor was Muslim labor, was Muslim know-how. And we have a few, like there was a prince from Africa who wrote his memoir in Arabic after he had been kidnapped and brought here. So the history of Islam in the United States is contiguous with the history of African slavery in the United States. It was very old. And then from the other side, the typical narrative of American history is often told from the point of view of English people landed in Massachusetts. But of course, there were other populations that became, central to American history, including the Latinos. And we know that Spain was Muslim and largely Berber and Arab. And when the Reconquista happened under the Castilians and finally succeeded in 1492, initially there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslims who remained in Spain. And they were forced by the Inquisition to convert to Catholicism. Many of them did a pro forma conversion. So, they would go to Mass on Sunday, but then they would, if you mentioned the Prophet Muhammad, they would say, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And they had to hide this from the Inquisition. So they were secret Muslims. And there were thousands of them in Spain. And then, after about 100 years, they expelled those too. They made it difficult. Many of these Muslims who, they were called Moriscos, who were in Spain, had to go to Algeria or Morocco or even Istanbul. But large numbers of them went to Seville and got on ships and came to the New World. And in the New World, the Inquisition wasn't as powerful and they had more freedom. So we don't know the history of this, but there were thousands and thousands of Latino Muslims in places like New Mexico and Mexico itself and so forth in the early modern period. So there's a hidden history of Islam in the United States, and while it's very difficult to get at, some of it can be gotten at through texts and so forth, but also I think increasingly with regard to the Latino population, we might be able to do some genetic history. So next slide, please. So that's my first point, which is Islam actually has a prehistory that's in the United States that's much older even than the United States, and which is often now forgotten about. And then the next big period of Muslim advent in the United States was in the Gilded Age, from about 1880, maybe a little bit before, until 1924. There was an enormous wave of immigration to the United States. 20 million people came at a time when, in 1900, the population of the whole country was only 100 million. So this was huge. And among the immigrants in this period were what we would now call Lebanese and Syrians. And about 10% of those who came were Muslim, and some proportion of those in turn were Shia. Then there were also the beginnings then of South Asian immigration in the United States, and a few of those were Muslims and Shia. So because of this wave of immigration, you get the first purposed standalone mosque in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. There were lots of little storefront mosques and buildings that were used for praying and so forth. But the first building that was built as a mosque and continued to exist for a long time was that in Cedar Rapids. And the Alsi family, who was very central in building that mosque, were Lebanese Shia. So the Shia were very important also in this wave of immigration. Next slide, please. Then in 1924, as a result of that huge wave of immigration to the United States, which included, Italians and Jews and people that the Protestant elite were very suspicious of and nervous about, and Poles, and many of them were socialists. They had Marxist tendencies, or they were anarchists. So in 1924, the United States changed the immigration laws, and they instituted racist immigration laws. They made quotas for each country. So as many Norwegians could come as liked, but all of a sudden only 400 Syrians could come a year. So in the period I was growing up, when I was a kid in the 50s, America had become very monochrome in a way because of the immigration laws favoring only Northern Europeans. And it was a time of Jim Crow in the South. It was a very racist time. But then in the 50s and 60s, you had the Civil Rights Movement. In 1965, they were finally embarrassed by these racist laws. And they changed the law, and they said each country in the world has an upper limit of 25,000 immigrants who could legally come. So they made every country equal in this regard. And this 1965 law kicked off a whole new wave of immigration to the United States, about half of which was Latino, but the rest was Africa and Asia. And it is the result of this wave of immigration since 1965 that the American Muslim community has grown so large. Sociologists estimate in 1965, when this law was passed, probably there were only about 100,000 Muslims in the United States. And a small proportion of those were white converts. Many of them had Lebanese or other regional antecedents. But after 65, then you have this huge, another huge wave of immigration. And so you get to the point where there are millions. How many million is controversial, but millions of Muslims in the United States. And the Shiites amongst them, you know, in the world as a whole, social statistics of this sort are hard to come by because, like, you know, nobody has ever counted the Afghans, and probably it would be dangerous to try. So we don't know exactly, but something like 10 to 15% of the world, of the world's Muslims are Shiite, and probably in the United States, it's on the upper side of that. As I say, it's likely, it seems to me, that 15% are Shiite in the United States. Much immigration to the United States, especially by Shiites, was what immigration specialists call push migration. That is to say, you can come to the United States because you have ambitions to be a great physician or entrepreneur, and you think that the U.S. is a place where your talents can shine. And so that draws people. That's pull immigration. But then you can also come to the United States because there's a war in your country and you're escaping. And so a lot of Shiite immigration in the United States was push immigration. There was a lot of trouble in Iraq, especially for the Shia. A lot of people came after 91. I know some of the families. Everybody lost family members at that time. People came from Iran. Not all of the ones who came from Iran were particularly religious. But there was a big Shiite immigration, at least with regard to heritage. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Pakistan have all seen a lot of trouble. So there, a lot of the Shiites who came to the United States are classic Americans, because what was the United States, you know, what was the myth of Plymouth Rock was the Puritans coming, fleeing religious persecution by the Anglican Church back in England. So wear that as a badge of honor, those of you to whom it applies. Next slide, please. Some of the push migration came because especially in recent decades, because of a rise of anti-Shiite politics in the region, which is complicated and differs from country to country. In Pakistan, you know, Pakistan as a country was founded in 1947 not as a theocracy. And indeed, the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was, by the way, a Shiite. He was from an Ismaili family, but he converted later in life, because he had very bad relations with the Aga Khan, to Twelver Shiism, at least pro forma. I don't think he was that interested in religion, to tell you the truth, but in any case, formally speaking, he was a Shiite. And Pakistan was founded not as a theocracy, and Jinnah said this. He said, you know, it's a refuge for the Muslims of South Asia because they were afraid of hardline Hindu domination once the British left. And so there's been a fight inside Pakistan in the 20th century and into the 21st between people who have a more tolerant, secular point of view on what Pakistan is, and many of them are religious people, and people who see Pakistan as an ideological state and who want to take it in the direction of a very rigid and hard-line vision of Islamic society. So you have groups like the Taliban now, or there are radical groups like Lashkar-e-Jhanavi. And some of these groups have a very hard line against Shiite Islam, against Sufi Islam, against Christians, against other minorities, so that, as I said, they have a very rigid ideological vision of what Pakistan is, which is, not true to the vision of the founders of the country, but also doesn't accord with how most Pakistanis view things. I mean, most Pakistanis are not particularly rigid with regard to the religious views, and there are intermarriages between Sunnis and Shiites, and there are lots of social occasions, and political parties are mixed, and so forth. So but those groups that have this very rigid and intolerant view of what Pakistan should be also seem to have access to C4 high explosives. So although they're small, I wouldn't estimate that there are more than 20,000 Taliban in northern Pakistan. And the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and groups like that, again, they're a fringe. They're like our Ku Klux Klan in the United States. But they're fiendishly clever in blowing things up and attacking people. And so they've committed assassinations of a whole string of Shiite notables in Pakistan, including physicians. Some of the origins of these feelings have to do with the class structure of Pakistan. In Jhang, for instance, the